The numbers don't tell you whether you should buy a business. They tell you what happened, but they don't tell you why it happened. And understanding the why and the story behind the numbers can be the difference between a really great deal and a really bad deal that costs you a lot of money and time. So one of the key stages when buying a business is diving into the numbers behind the business and really trying to understand the story around where it's been, where it is today, and where it can go. And the better you can understand that, the better position you'll be in to decide whether or not you want to go ahead with putting an offer on it, how much you're prepared to pay, what the key terms and conditions of that offer will be. So this is the stage before putting an offer in. When you buy a business, there's some very clear stages, and I've seen lots of people buying and selling businesses over the years, and they can kind of jump around and it creates a very inefficient, a lot more costly process. But if you actually follow these very clear, distinct steps and work through one at a time and then decide whether or not you're proceeding and whether or not you're proceeding, it makes the process a whole lot more efficient. You typically get a much better deal and you don't waste time and money. So one of those key steps is, prior to making an offer on the business, this is your time to do a commercial review and really understand it. Now, one of the parts of understanding it is getting the financial information, and it's not just financial information in terms of, you know, your profit and loss, your balance sheet, your cash flow, although they are very key pieces of financial information. But there's lots of other pieces of data that support and help you work out the story behind what this business is doing and why. So really your objective here is not just to review the numbers, but to really understand the story behind those numbers and the why. And I'll try and explain the difference. So let's look at an example. You have two different businesses. Let's say this business over here has generated 30% revenue growth. This business over here only generated 10% revenue growth. Which business sounds more appealing to begin with? So typically people would go 30% revenue growth is better than 10% revenue growth, right? That's pretty easy to understand. But what we want to do is we don't just stop there. We dive in and we understand why, and we ask the questions and we get behind what is the story behind these numbers. So say the business with the 30% revenue growth, say 70% of that came from one customer. The business with 10% revenue growth, that came from 10 to 15 different customers, and not a single customer makes up more than 10% of its revenue. Now which business looks more attractive? If this business here lost that key customer, you lost 70% of your revenue. And for most businesses, that's a real risk and concern. If this business lost its top customer, the maximum you're ever going to be impacted by is 10%. Now 10% is still 10%, it's still, you know, a hit, but it's much more recoverable and much easier to combat with other things than a 70% drop. Now, which business looks more attractive? We go another step and we understand more about the story behind these numbers. Perhaps we find out that this business, although 70% of it of the revenues come from just that one customer, perhaps that was a new revenue line. And perhaps that one customer was a test, and that went really, really well, and that's why it's suddenly 70% of the revenue, because this new product line launch went incredibly well, and the customer loved it and has ordered a whole lot, and therefore they're now at 70% and by far the largest customer. But that was just a test. That was the first customer they've tested on. They now have a list of 20 other potential target customers that look like that original customer that they are now ready to roll it out to. This business over here has had the 10% revenue growth. It's spread between 15 to 20 different customers, not one making up more than 10% of the total revenue, so that's all positive. But actually, it's been pretty stagnant, and they haven't had a lot of new customers, and 10% growth is still good, but it's not exceptional, and it doesn't look like there's much more room to grow. Now which business looks better? So the point of this is trying to get you thinking beyond looking at the numbers and looking and just asking those questions. Well, why? What is the story behind the numbers? And the story is the really fun part. And I'm an accountant, so I obviously love the numbers, but the reason I love the numbers is because they're not just numbers on a page, they tell me a story. And if that story doesn't make sense, the numbers don't make sense, you just haven't understood the story enough. So you just need to keep understanding why, what happened. And the more you can understand that, the better placed you are to predict what might happen in the future, make as good a decisions as you can, and make the best decision when it comes to buying a business. So let's look at some other examples. One of the massive areas I've seen in my experience is understanding the profit margins. The reason these are really important is because particularly your gross profit margin is really important, because if it is wrong, that difference comes straight off your profit. Now let me explain this to you. So you have revenue, then you have what we call direct costs, and the best way to think of those is that those costs are only incurred if the revenue happens. So think of them like the cost to make the product, the cost to freight the product, the cost for your person to pick and pack the order, the packaging costs. It's costs that if you don't generate that revenue, you're not having to incur that costs. Then the difference is your gross profit and your gross profit margin. Now the reason this is really important, because say that gross profit margin, they tell you it's 50%, but really it's only 40%. That difference comes straight off the profit. So say you have a business making $1 million revenue, your direct costs, the cost directly related to generating that revenue, are $500,000. Your gross profit is $500,000. Say you still got $1 million worth of revenue, but your gross profit margin is actually only 40%. So that means you've got $1 million revenue, you've got $600,000 worth of cost, and only $400,000 gross profit and a 40% profit margin. So that difference between a 50% profit margin and a 40% profit margin is $100,000 if the revenue's $1 million, and that is just pure profit going out the door. And a business is valued based on profit. So it means not only if this gross profit margin is wrong, or you don't understand it correctly to predict what it's going to be in the future, not only will you pay too much because you pay based on profit, but you're also not going to get that profit in the future. You think you're going to be buying a business that is generating X revenue, and it's not, it's less than that. So understanding the gross profit margin is really crucial. So when we come back to the point of this video of understanding the numbers and the story behind the numbers, understanding your true costs is really important. And I've got lots of examples of where this has gone wrong, but one that comes to mind is I had a client looking to buy a bunch of pubs, they're in the hospitality industry. I've had a lot of clients over the years in the hospitality industry. That industry is incredibly tough. That would be one of my, I generally steer clear of that industry. It is a very tough industry. And one of the areas is the profit margins are really tight. Now this business my client was looking to buy, they were reporting that they made a 40% gross profit margin. And all I simply did is when they told me that, I was like, well, I can look at all these other clients I've had that can't do that. And those clients on average, I can't remember the exact numbers, but let's say those clients on average had a 25% gross profit margin. And this business is claiming it had 40%. So straight away to me, that is a red flag. And you don't have to have, I had lots of clients in the industry to compare it to, but you can simply Google, what are key industry stats on different lines within your profit and loss. But this one stood out, and when I dived into it to understand it, I actually found out that one of his suppliers was his brother, and he wasn't getting charged fair market rates. And that difference was huge. And it's interesting because we found this out, and my client then went and said this to the seller, what's the deal? And the seller managed to convince my client that those prices would stay the same, and that his brother's business would continue to sell it at those prices. So he went ahead and bought the business, which was against our advice, but his decision. And a year later, the supplier put the prices back up to market, and 2 years later, the business went under. So it's really important to not just look at the numbers and go, oh yeah, that looks great, but to understand why are the numbers that way? What is the story? What is this telling me? Another couple of examples, very common ones is the owner's time is very, very common for if it's an owner-operated business, so the existing owner of the business is working in that business, for their cost to not truly be reflected in the numbers. So you can look at it and go, oh yes, this is very profitable, but actually the owner's working 80 hours a week and the accounts reflect 30 hours a week of his time, because he says, oh yes, I manage it, works for itself and I just oversee it and it's just 30 hours of my time, but that's not the reality at all. So that's very common. One of the other common ones is businesses under investing. So you could look at your overheads and you say, oh, you know, the overheads are low, that's really positive, but actually you find that, just pick an example, let's say the rent line, and you find that the premises that they're in, they're at capacity, and that they've totally overgrown the space, there is no room for growth in that space. But in the financials, the rent is low, which means the profit is higher, and that looks really positive. But actually the story behind that number is that they've underinvested and they have not set the business up for growth. And if you were to buy that business, the rent would not stay the same if you wanted to grow the business, and you would need to move premises, get more space. Your cost is going to go up, your profit is going to come down. So the key message is really to understand the story behind the numbers, the why behind the numbers, and don't just take them at face value. And as I started with, the more you can understand this before you are then going to put an offer forward, it's critical. It's really, really important, because how can you decide whether you're going to buy a business, what you're prepared to pay, what terms you want in that contract, what conditions you're going to have, if you haven't dived in and understood those numbers really well and you naturally know the story of what's happening in that business. Now, of course, every business has risks. There is always the unknown. Recently with the fuel prices going up, with the war in Iran, perfect example, there's not a lot you can do about that. But you can do something about understanding that 70% of the revenue come from one person, one customer, versus over here, the max is only 10% from one customer. You can do something about understanding that actually this one has huge growth potential and they've proven something and there's massive potential, versus this one's gone stagnant. So there is a lot you can try and understand, and the more you can understand that, the better you placed you are to decide, do I want to buy this business? If I'm going to buy it, what am I prepared to pay? And then at that price, what are my conditions, what are my key terms, and how am I going to structure that deal? So this is really important to do that in that phase, so that you can put an offer forward, knowing the best possible view, and it gives you the best chance of putting forward the best possible offer and deal. Then it's after that, and after that negotiation period, and you come to an agreement, then you go into due diligence. So a lot of people get confused and start muddling all these steps and doing it all at once, and it can end up costing you a whole lot of time and money, or you can waste time doing due diligence when there's actually no deal to be done to begin with, or you've understood the story and actually you don't want to buy it, or you're not prepared to pay what the seller wants you to pay, and actually there is no deal. So you don't dive into due diligence until you have got a deal signed and agreed on the table. And then when you dive into due diligence, it's a little bit different. So here you've understood the story, and here you are verifying and checking, and as much as possible independent checking. So here I'm understanding why my gross profit margin is the way it is. Here I'm actually getting some supplier contracts, I'm seeing them, I'm price checking them, I'm going to the market and seeing whether those are true market costs and checking them back. Here I'm getting their list of summary accounts to review. Here I'm pre-offer, when I'm understanding the story, and then here once I'm in due diligence, I'm actually reconciling those numbers back to the tax returns that they filed, their formal statutory financial statements, to make sure what they gave me here is the truth. So they're both number steps where you're diving into the numbers, but here you're trying to understand the story and the why to help you make the decision on deal, no deal. Due diligence is just verifying and making sure everything they told you stacks up and the business is what you were led to believe it to be, and that there's no hidden skeletons in the closet or risks that would make you change your mind on that deal that you've agreed with. So I hope that was helpful. There's a whole lot more to it than that, and I can talk about numbers for far too long, but we'll stop it there. But the key message really is that buying a business isn't just about reading the financial statements. It's about understanding the story, understanding the why behind those numbers. And once you can do that, you can make much better decisions and avoid costly mistakes and avoid wasting time and money on deals that just aren't the right deals for you. So in this, I've explained a little bit about the process and a couple of those steps in very high level. I've put together my playbook called the Complete Deal Playbook, and this is designed to teach you through each step. So as I've said, there are very clear steps. You go one at a time, and there are clear intentions, objectives in each one, questions and decisions that you need to be able to make, and then you move on to the next one. So the Complete Deal Playbook I've written to try and take my experience doing this for years with lots of different businesses and try and just distill it down into some really clear, practical steps in this framework to help you work through the process, right from you haven't even looked at a business yet, but what is it that you're even looking for? What are the different options of things that you can look for in a business, and what is it that you're particularly looking for? Right through all the various steps of the commercial review, making an offer, due diligence, legals, all of that, right through to settlement where you actually pay the money and you now become the owner. So it talks you through the whole process, aimed at being very practical, giving you lots of questions, things to think about, and just making sure you understand the objective of each step, what you're trying to achieve, and how you best go about it. So if that sounds interesting to you, check it out. That's my Complete Deal Playbook, and the link is in the description or in my bio. And if you found this video interesting, I will be doing more on various topics, so please subscribe, please like. If there's particular topics you would like to hear about, please just chuck them in the comments below or email me and I'll pop them on my list to cover. Thank you for your time. Have a good day.